Hello, I am Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our program today, What's at Stake for Labor, Project 2025 in the Department of Government Efficiency. I'm so appreciative to our moderator, Samir Sonti, Professor of Urban Studies at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and to our speakers, James Goodwin, Policy Director for the Center of Progressive Reform, Diana Reddy, Assistant Professor, UC Berkeley Law, and Arjun Singh, Senior Podcast Producer of The Lever. I also want to acknowledge the public engagement team, Michael Lalonde, Nadia Rahman, and Rose Imparato for their work running the logistics for tonight's event. Before turning attention to today's program, I want to take a moment to plug SLU's Diversity Scholarship and to encourage folks to consider applying and or to share with this info with their friends, families, and coworkers. The Joseph F. Murphy Institute Scholarship is dedicated for the purpose of fostering diverse leadership in the labor movement and in the academic discipline of labor studies. The scholarship application is now online, and the deadline to apply is March 4th. You'll find all kind of the information you need to know about the scholarship process in the chat. I also want to promote a program in honor of Jane McAlevey that is happening on Tuesday, February 18th. In the evening at the Grad Center, CUNY Grad Center, and it's organized by the Nation, Jacobin, and the Murphy Institute. The registration details for She Usually Wins, Remembering Jane McAlevey should be in the chat. Turning to today's program, we'll have time for audience Q&A, and I just want to remind folks to use the Q&A function to share your questions. And also, we have links in the chat with more info on our speakers and their research. I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from Samir and Diana and James and Arjun, and I invite you to join me in welcoming them tonight here to our virtual SLU panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and Michael, Nadia, Rose, everyone at the Murphy Institute who put this together. My name is Samir Sonti. I am a faculty member at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And I'm, well, I suppose thrilled is one way to put it, but certainly eager to be hosting and moderating this panel discussion entitled What's at Stake for Labor, Project 2025 and the Department of Government Efficiency. The pace of events over the last few days has accelerated in a way that is disorienting. And the implications for working people, for workers' movements, and for the institutions, legal victories, social programs that have been won by working people over the last century are very much in question. We don't know what's going to happen, and we would be kidding everyone attending here if we pretended to. But I really couldn't think of a more ideal group of people to help us think through what's going on right now and what's at stake. We have three really illustrious panelists. Let me briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to just kind of let them take it away because these are experts that have spent a lot of time before 2024 and before 2016 thinking about the questions that we're discussing today. So our panelists are James Goodwin. James is the policy director at the Center for Progressive Reform, where he's spent the past 70 years or 70 would be a lot, 17 years working on questions like those which we're going to discuss today. Prior to joining CPR, James worked as a legal intern for the Environmental Law Institute and the Ecologics Group. He's a published author with articles on human rights and environmental law and policy, appearing in venues like the Michigan Journal on Public Affairs and the New England Law Review, where he's a co-author with Armin Rosencrantz. Although he's only been at Center for Progressive Reform for 17 years, his wealth of experience would make you one think that he's been there for 70, as you'll all learn in a few moments. Our next panelist is Diana Reddy. Diana is an assistant professor at the UC Berkeley School of Law, where she teaches courses on organized labor and civil rights, law and political economy, and social movement advocacy. Her research on the regulation of work as a site where critical choices are made about the relationship between American economic commitments and its democratic ideals has been published in a wide range of prestigious journals, including the Yale Law Journal, the Emory Law Journal, and various others, as well as the Law and Political Economy blog. Prior to returning to academia, Diana spent years working as an attorney representing labor unions and workers at the AFL-CIO, the California Teachers Association, and for labor law firms, worker side labor law firms. And finally, our third panelist, Arjun Singh, is a longtime veteran reporter and podcast producer who currently hosts a terrific program, Lever Time, which is put out by the investigative news outlet The Lever, which for those who haven't encountered The Lever, I highly recommend it. Some of the most really deep and cutting edge investigative reporting about a variety of issues in the financial sector and elsewhere. Previously with the Washington Post and NPR's WGBH and WBUR, Arjun is a recent winner of the Webby Award presented by the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. These are three, again, extraordinary panelists to talk about what's going on right now, where it comes from, what's been happening, and where we may be going. So I'm going to pass it on to them. We'll start with James, then we'll move to Diana and Arjun. Let the three of them talk with one another a bit, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please submit your questions through the chat function or whatever the function, the appropriate function is, and I'll make sure to pass them along. Thank you all. All right, James, take it away.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you to SLU for hosting this, and thank you to all the audience for tuning in on Wednesday night for this discussion. Because we are about to talk about something called the administrative state, right? You've heard this term probably thrown around a lot. It's probably been used in like a pejorative sense, particularly from conservatives. But I submit we should reclaim this term. There's nothing to be ashamed of, the administrative state. But if we're going to talk about the administrative state a lot, because that's really in a lot of ways what's at issue with Project 2025 and the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Let me suggest maybe a common way of understanding it. So I could give you the really boring answer of what the administrative state is. It would be the collection of executive branch agencies, institutions, procedures over which the president and Congress have like shared responsibility, and that's charged with taking legislation that Congress and the president have passed and translating into on the ground policies, things that make a difference in our life. That's the boring answer. I prefer the more exciting answer. If you study constitutional law, you know we have these three coordinate branches, and they really were designed to preserve sort of elite rule in various ways. And that's, I don't say it worked, but nobody kicked up much of a fuss for a long time, for maybe the first 100 years or so of our nation's history. And then towards, once we get to the Industrial Revolution, when we really start having like what we now today think of as public problems, public policy problems, it became increasingly clear that the three coordinate branches that we had were not up to the task of meeting the demands of what the public was defining as policy problems, or coming up with solutions that satisfy them. So we have a group of progressive thinkers, progressive advocates, the labor community, all coming together and sort of building this institution, the administrative state, on the fly, right? First at the state level, and then increasingly towards the federal level. And it's not been perfect since its inception, but it's a hell of a lot more democratic. It's a hell of a lot more responsive to the public, a hell of a lot more inclusive of the public, right? Basically, it has been able to meet the public demand for changing policy problems as our economy and society has evolved over the last 150 years or so. Needless to say, industry first tried to capture it. Well, the industry didn't know what to do with it, right? They tried to capture it. They've succeeded in various ways. Then there was sort of the neoliberal answer of we're just going to shrink it down to the size where we can strangle it in the bathtub and kill it. But even that never actually worked out too well. And so now we have this new thing, this new sort of vision that's encapsulated in Project 2025. And point of fact, is a huge departure. It's not about eliminating or shrinking the administrative state. It's really about, well, there's a lot of that in there, don't get me wrong, but there's also a lot of like building up the administrative state in key ways. So for like immigration, maintaining racial hierarchy, maintaining patriarchy, all those sort of Christian nationalism, all those things require a lot of state capacity, as it turns out. And so there's actually in Project 2025 and DOGE a lot of attention to building state capacity towards harnessing the power of the administrative state as it exists and deploying it in these nefarious and authoritarian ways. And so that's if that's my very long-winded way of setting up this conversation and what this fight is all really about, as I see it. So I look forward to hearing from my co-panelists and your questions about these issues.
Thank you, James. Diana, please.
Thank you so much, Samir. Thank you, everyone who tuned in for this. It's really a delight to be in conversation with this particular audience. I think it's really important to be having these conversations right now. So I want to echo a few things that have already been said. Number one, as Samir pointed out, it's really hard to say what is going to happen. We are living in unprecedented times. So I think my comments are not intended to say what will happen or provide any kind of clear vision of what's ahead. I think anyone who says they have a clear vision of what's ahead, you question that because things are evolving constantly. When I talk about what the Trump administration means for labor and for labor law, there are a couple of things that I focus on, though. First of all, the reality of kind of really major fissures within contemporary conservatism. And sometimes on the left, we emphasize these and sometimes we don't. I think in our desire to construct, a potential enemy, we will sometimes say like, Trumpism or, whatever we want to describe as like this really kind of cohesive force. And the fact is it's not entirely. And you see that specifically in Project 2025 and particularly on what it has to say about labor. So there's a lot in there that is kind of traditional business anti-unionism. And particularly with the twinge, or not even twinge, the kind of really explicit Christian nationalism, get rid of critical race theory, encourage employers to offer the Sabbath as a day of rest. So really specific things like that. But it is couched in both kind of a framing, which, start the very first statement, the mission statement. At the heart of the conservative promise is the resolve to reclaim the role of each American worker as the protagonist in his or her own life. Right? If I just read that, I would say, yeah, yeah, that sounds great. But it's not just talk. There are also kind of really interesting nuggets of both showing kind of unique levels of support for a very conservative document. There's specifically language about empowering the National Labor Relations Board to increase the use of 10J injunctions so as to punish and stop employers from violating labor law. There is also, kind of other language that's consistent with trying to link labor to some of their other issues, a provision about encouraging employers to provide on-site childcare, which, I would be on board with that. That would be great. And then there is an explicit acknowledgement of the fact that the coalition that created this document is not all of the same mind about what to do about labor. And so, there's this language in here about what to do about project labor agreements. And it says, while some conservatives, including the author of this chapter, believe that it would be a mistake to antagonize unions' core interests, others argue that the next administration should end project labor agreements and repeal Davis-Bacon and so forth, right? So, they're telling us we are unsure of exactly the track that we're going to take. So I emphasize this both because I think it's important for, figuring out what labor should do, because I think there's both promise and potential in these fissures and kind of real danger for labor. When Project 2025 says we don't want to antagonize labor's core interests, but they want to get rid of wokeism in unions, and they want to, challenge, what they see as this, encroaching of core interests on other social justice issues. They're very much talking about dividing the working class, and particularly appealing to kind of underlying divisions within the working class, on race, gender, LGBT plus issues, and so forth. And I also think this is really important for looking at what we've seen so far, because I think a lot of folks thought that as soon as Trump took office, he would be targeting the National Labor Relations Board. And to be clear, he fired the chair, the only Black woman who has been chair of the NLRB in American history. He did fire General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, the greatest general counsel, I think, from the perspective of labor that we have ever had at that agency. So it's not that he's, leaving the agency alone. But if you, at the same time, though, his nominee for Secretary of Labor, Lori Chavez, is someone who, by accounts of the unions that have worked with her, is legitimately pro-labor conservative. So, as to regulating the private sector workforce, I think those divisions are going to be really important. What Trump has done, absolutely, is take on federal employees. And I think there are a number of different ways to think about this, right? On the one hand, he's attacking government itself, right? And I think there's been an emphasis on that. There's also the extent to which he is, kind of culling the herd to incentivize loyalty, to discourage whistleblowing, to discourage, real checks and balances on his power. And in that way, it feels consistent with, this is just a giant power grab. I think it's also important, though, that, his Schedule F policy career executive order would also result in federal employees losing their collective bargaining rights, losing membership. So far, I think some of the organizations that have filed the most lawsuits are unions, right? AFG, AFSCME, they're there kind of like trying to keep track on him. And so I think it's important to see this as partly a fight against public sector labor unions. And I think, to some extent, it's worth asking, is that just about the power of public sector unions? Or is it also kind of another attack at, I think what Trump sees is the professional managerial class. The reality is that unionism in the United States is bifurcated right now between public sector unionism and private sector unionism. As of 2024, the public sector was 32.2% unionized. The private sector was 5.9%. And so, kind of the attacks in the 1980s and 1990s on private sector unions largely left public sector unions, not immune, but they were not the focus of the kind of anti-unionism of the neoliberal period. But in the wake of the Great Recession, we saw a turn to really challenging state and local worker unions, saying that they were the cause of budget deficits and the like. And now we see this kind of emphasis on challenging federal workers and federal unions. And it is worth noting that, the composition of the federal workforce is one of the kind of more highly educated workforces. When we think about politics today, right, there's this increasing cleavage based on education. It's actually, I was just looking this up, and it's really interesting because 35% of private for-profit workers have high school degrees or less, right? So kind of the most working class, by educational measures, is in the private for-profit sector, whereas that's only 17.1% in government employment, and I'm sure that's even lower when we're talking about federal government because of kind of the importance of expertise in professions and graduate degrees. So I've already talked too long for my introduction, but I think it's just important to think about this not just as, a fascist move or a government move, but it's also about kind of class cleavages and using the power of law to weaken the unions he doesn't like, while perhaps continuing to provide some benefits here and there to the unions he does like, the ones he thinks are more likely to support him, but in so doing really kind of weakening an already weak labor movement. And so in terms of what labor can do, I mean, I think it's all about how do we build broader working class solidarity across these, really important cleavages.
Thanks, Diana. Arjun.
Yeah, thank you everybody for having me. It's an honor to be here. It's really humbling to be with such esteemed company. I hope that I can, fill in with some informative things. Whereas you guys are all such great experts in the technical nature of this. I think in my role as a journalist, I've sort of spent the last 8 years trying to understand the human motivations behind many of our political leaders. Part of the problem, but sometimes the benefit of our democratic process is that it is human beings making decisions. And throughout history, there's a startling amount of decisions that impacted millions, sometimes billions of people that came down to personal feelings, nature, and motivations. And so throughout the past week and when Trump got elected, I really thought about back from 2016 to 2020, what motivates someone like Donald Trump? And I think thinking about Trump and Elon Musk as that these people are not CEOs, or not just the CEO class, they have a very dictatorial style when it comes to how they run their companies and their enterprises. Trump has been compared in many ways to organized criminal leaders, loyalty oaths, tests of loyalty, pushing people out and pushing them under the bus when he feels that they have turned on him. I think one interesting thing is almost everyone who allied with Trump in his first term spent some time in prison or jail trying to protect or save that relationship. And Elon Musk is very similar. I had SpaceX and Tesla, when he bought Twitter, his management style, which he's learned from people like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, is to basically come in and act as the ultimate authority. And for the people in Silicon Valley of this ilk, Peter Thiel in particular, he's an angel investor, one of the first investors in Facebook, big conservative donor. Thiel and Musk founded PayPal together. Musk may have come in a little after Thiel had initially founded it. But what was interesting, I think, about Thiel is that Thiel taught Mark Zuckerberg to run Facebook like a dictatorship. He said that leaders need to be able to operate with this kind of authority to get things done. And he taught Zuckerberg how to create a structure of his stocks and board seats in a way that he was never able to get fired from the board. Basically saying this company is my fiefdom. I feel like I'm on a big tangent here, But I think where this all comes back is looking at the events of Doge and Schedule F, as Diana said. When I did some reporting on Project 2025, one of the most interesting things I found out was the head of Project 2025 inside the Heritage Foundation is a person named Paul Dans. And Paul Dans isn't just a conservative. He's not just a, Christian nationalist. Paul Dans is a Trump acolyte. This person moved to New York City in the mid 2000s. In 2012, he was trying to convince Donald Trump to run for president. He loved Donald Trump more than anything. And when he came into the Trump administration, he felt that not only were people not good at their jobs, he felt there was disloyalty, this effort to sort of sabotage Donald Trump. And what he eventually went out of the administration and into Heritage with was, how do we recreate the government with people like me, people who are loyal to Donald Trump and who will do whatever Donald Trump wants. This week, Elon Musk forcibly took control of our $6 trillion payment apparatus within the US Treasury. Now, it turns out that the US Secretary of Treasury, I'm not sure if he's been confirmed yet, Scott Bessent, not only did Scott Bessent approve of Musk going in, when Scott Bessent was speaking with Trump about the job, Trump told Bessent that he wanted someone who had the credibility of Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary, but someone who is going to let Trump bring in whoever he wanted to into Treasury to do whatever they needed to do. And Scott Bessent said, yes, I promise. So it was a loyalty pledge. And that loyalty pledge seems to have evolved into Musk now coming in. And so to kind of wrap up what I'm trying to get at, the way that I see these moves is that for laborers and workers, these are bringing in a new style of management that became popular within Silicon Valley, which was to have dictatorial CEOs and billionaire leaders, and to create companies where everyone were fanatically devoted to the cause of the CEO and also were so sort of molded in the CEO's image. Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, was eventually kicked out of Uber because he created a toxic culture because he mostly staffed Uber with men like him, young, broy, people who are liable to get engaged in sexual assault and harassment. That was Kalanick's management style. He's currently managing Doge or advising Doge. Bill Ackman, the Wall Street billionaire titan, he became very prominent in the last few years because he circulated the idea of creating a blacklist of any law school student that participated in protests over Israel's actions in Gaza. And he is also currently advising Doge. And so I think that you see this strain within this administration that they figured out these means to bypass any sort of oversight of them because their fundamental belief is that any enterprise should be run around a leader. The people who work there should have rabid, fanatical loyalty to that leader, do whatever the leader wants, and be like the leader in personality. And so I think this is what a lot of federal workers are very frightened about right now. Not only are they frightened that they're going to lose their jobs, but that they don't trust that this is an administration that has even an ideology. It is putting in people who are going to be similar to Elon Musk or to Donald Trump. And what does that portend for the federal workforce? But broadly, these people bypass every regulation they can. I think it also raises big questions for what will it mean to be a worker in a country where this becomes the dominant form of management, which is to kick down labor protections, but also not just do your job on merit, but do your job based on loyalty, whether that's to an ideology or to a person.
Thanks, Arjun. Well, this is a great set of opening remarks to get us going. I want to start. I just have I know a lot of our audience is curious or going to be curious about, what is happening at the Treasury right now, what is happening at the DOL, at the Department of Labor today, as I understand. Doge was attempting to get access to the Department of Labor. And so I promise we will get to some of the sort of specific technical dimensions of what's going on right now. But I want to start by trying to weave together pull together a question from that occurred to me as each of you were speaking about the origins of this particular current of conservatism. You know, the attacks on, you know, what James called the administrative state. This is things like the EPA, the NLRB, OSHA, right? These are long-standing conservative ambitions to weaken the ability of these agencies to enforce regulations in the interests of working people, of the environment, of, you know, other disadvantaged groups. And as James notes, right, what we're seeing with Project 2025 is not pure and simple burn it down, but sort of repurpose it in the interests of a particular vision of what the state should be. Not eliminate every agency, though maybe eliminate some of them, maybe eliminate the Department of Education, but leave some of them with actually enhanced state capacity in other ways. So not necessarily no regulation, but different kinds of regulation. And as Diana notes, right, with respect to labor policy, the class cleavages that the administration appears intent upon heightening are not, certainly not pro-worker, but a different kind of anti-worker than your old school Republican zealot. And then Arjun, as you know, you kind of draw the personality, like the cult of personality associated with this particular current of right-wing populism. And so I guess I'm curious, like, if you can just help us understand, or help the audience understand where this comes from, what's distinct about it from more familiar styles of conservatism, maybe even what's distinct about it from the first Trump administration in terms of the way that it functioned, and what the stakes of this new style of conservatism are. So anyone who wants to take that rambling and incoherent question first, please go for it.
No, I that's actually a great question. It's something that we spent a lot of episodes on Lever Time covering, and I think you hit on a very important, crucial point, which is, you know, if you talk to the old era of Republicans, what they called country club Republicans, the Reagan-Bush style, pro-corporate, low taxes, but, you know, they were free traders. They wanted a relative degree of stability within society, because I think many of them understood that a functioning society is a functioning economy. Lower social instability is more time spent on productivity and capitalism. And that was sort of fed in well with the kind of neoliberal order that came in with around the 1990s. And within conservatism, I think what you see happening is that there was a devil's bargain really made between the right-wing corporate sector and the right-wing cultural population, and that actually came to manifest within heritage. So it wasn't until the late 1970s and the 1980s that people who were both conservative, Christian nationalists were allied with corporate Republicans. They weren't really on the same side of issues, but when this guy named Paul Weyrich joined Heritage, he co-founded it with Joseph Coors' money, Coors of the beer company, and he said, let's bring these two ideas together. We have the people, you've got the resources, and let's figure out how we create platforms that, yes, are pro-corporate, but also really cater to very fundamentalist Christian attitudes. And they didn't really always make sense with each other. I think one of the most interesting things is on issues of environmentalism and the climate, where actually a lot of, you know, people in rural areas and many of the places most severely affected by hurricanes currently right now are conservative Republican areas, Louisiana, the Gulf Coast of Florida. And that didn't really make sense, but the party kind of created the machinery through Heritage to just say that these things go hand in hand. And that was why you had people like Charles Koch, who doesn't go to church, who's not a religious person, who's been documented as saying he thinks religion is an opiate for the masses. He doesn't respect people who are religious. he is bankrolling people like Ronald Reagan, some of the most conservative Christian candidates. And then Trump shows up and he flips that whole thing. He is absolutely not a, Christian. I mean, he may be right now, but when he ran, he had, was known for many of his marriages, his affairs, his uh, grotesque kind of behavior on the public stage. And when the evangelical vote went for him, you could really see it was that transactional nature. Trump was going into these places and saying, who do you want? I'll give you your judges. I'll give you this. And I think, in some ways, he's done that in other ways. And I think Trump has culturally become a little bit more conservative himself too. But I think where you are right now is you do see that. You have Trump clearly dominating the party, and you have all of these old era of conservatives unsure of what to do. Where I think that comes from is I think that populism in general has been growing over the last couple of decades. But I think that there was a big break from the sort of country club Republicans in the 1990s when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, became very prominent. You saw a lot of Midwestern communities in particular lose their jobs. And people like Pat Buchanan, he ran against George Herbert Walker Bush, primaried him on that platform. You gave away our jobs. You and Ronald Reagan, us conservatives, should be about the people, the Americans. And he infused it like Trump with nativism and racism. And this movement, I think, was slowly percolating. And it kind of comes to a heat in the 2012 election when Mitt Romney shows up. Not only does Romney lose the election, but he's a private equity executive. And I think that Trump just happened to kind of emerge, and he hit this population in such a they found him charismatic. I mean, he has all the hallmarks of sort of your classic demagogue, charismatic leader. And Trump, for whatever reason, I think mainly because Trump operates off the idea of being, quote, ripped off, he kind of allied with this right-wing populism. But to Diana's point about his hatred of the professional managerial class, that was an easy target for people who were upset at neoliberalism. He just said the presidents are terrible, the governors are terrible, the rich executives are terrible. Let's tear it all down. And he attached himself to right-wing populism. But I don't know how much Trump really believes in that or understands it. He's also a man who believes the stock market's his best indicator. He surrounded himself with Wall Street cronies. And you see this tension constantly playing out in the administration. The two figures who did it best were over the H-1B visa. Elon Musk was in favor of H-1B visas, and Steve Bannon was completely against it. He also said a lot of very racist things about Indian Americans, which is neither here nor there, I guess. But Bannon was coming from a very right-wing populist argument. There are good, smart American engineers. Don't bring in H-1B workers. Don't do that. Musk is an immigrant himself, works out of Silicon Valley and in industry. He relies on H-1B visas at all of his companies. They completely came to loggerheads over it. And that was Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Both in one way or the other were the architects of the respective campaigns. And so I think that that's where it comes from. There was always a base that was very powerful in conservative politics that was in favor of this stuff. The leadership had always remained more in the old country club era. And Trump came in, he wanted power, and he found natural allies with the base. And with the base's support, he doesn't need the establishment support anymore. He doesn't need the endorsements of old school Republicans. I don't think he's been endorsed by any of the living Republican ex-presidents, which might just be George W. Bush this time. But he doesn't need them. He switched it. Now they need him. So I think that's where it comes from.
I wanted to jump in on the excellent question, both about kind of class cleavages and where do they come from, and then also the connection between kind of Musk and his vision of management and the attacks on the administrative state. So, when you talk about kind of class cleavages in politics, I mean, it's really important to, center kind of the neoliberal consensus of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, right? I mean, there was an explicit choice in the Democratic Party to kind of walk away from being the party of union. Some of my research focuses on this, right? And so, like the advisor to President Carter is, in the New York Times saying, we don't want union endorsements. They make us look bad. Right. And so then there's this kind of sense at the time that who they want to appeal to is professionals, right? So that kind of there's this new class of people who are getting higher degrees. And, it's like the professionals are the future. Is not to say the Republican Party at that time was any better when it came to working class, politics. They absolutely were not. But there was a vacuum. And so, into that vacuum, choices were made, following, I think, Obama's success. To some extent, there was kind of, in the Republican Party, there was some soul searching. And then, depending on what you want to say, did like true natural leaders who really believed what they were saying emerge, or were there kind of, political entrepreneurs who said, I see something here in our politics that's not being addressed. Folks, who are, who have run businesses or who are particularly kind of used to being like, we just have to act strategically. In contrast to, and I don't want to belabor this, right? But I do sometimes think that one of the problems with the Democratic Party of late is that it is so kind of full of professionals who are really hard to organize, right? Who are really hard to kind of, I try to think about faculty meetings, and like it's like herding cats, right? Whereas other folks who have, and that's part of what it is to be a professional, right? You have your own independent judgment and discretion, and you like that is independent of what anyone else may say or do. And so I think, you kind of see like this strategic alignment of conservative forces, while within the Democratic Party, there's this kind of, what do we exactly represent, and how do we coalesce to form a real like meaningful coalition? The other thing to say is, of course, about the current attacks on the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board. There were arguments today in the Fifth Circuit on this very issue. There are now, I think, more than 20 cases arguing that the National Labor Relations Board is unconstitutional, notwithstanding the fact that in 1937 the Supreme Court said it was constitutional. And of course, there were a few cases along this making such arguments in 2023, but they weren't getting much attention. The case that kind of opens up the floodgates is when SpaceX files suit in January of 2024 saying that the NLRB is unconstitutional. And that happens just days after the board issues a complaint against them for allegedly engaging in retaliation for protected activity when they fired workers who were critical of Elon Musk, right? And so I think you do see there, right, like this real thing of no, people cannot, the firing of those workers was Elon Musk's like, people can't say bad things about me and work here. And then the idea of, suing the NLRB to say, who are you? Who are you to hold me to account? And so, I think the role then of Elon Musk in this kind of mishmash of fissured conservatives is, kind of particularly concerning when it comes to labor. And with regard to, the visit to the Department of Labor today, the Department of Labor is investigating, Elon Musk for labor practices, right? So it really is kind of a much, not necessarily deeply, it may be ideological, but it's also very personal, to Arjun's point.
Really, when I look at Project 2025, I see like a effort to renegotiate the right-wing coalition, a coalition that has always been fragile in various ways because it brings together such disparate elements. And you sort of see that within the current Trump tent, right? Russ Vought is not very much like Elon Musk, for example, and neither of them are much like Steve Bannon, yet they all sort of fit together in a strange sort of way under this umbrella of Project 2025. So it was meant to reforge like an uneasy alliance amongst these folks. It was meant to project So internally, it was meant to do that, but also externally, it was meant to project sort of a uniformity, something like almost to like frighten the rest of us, right? So there was very much this interim sort of aspiration behind it. Um, uh, and you know that is not and already you sort of see that breaking down in various ways. You know, how we deal with immigration, how we deal with tariffs, all those sorts of things were supposed to be sort of punted or papered over for now. And it's just going to be a matter of time before they spill out into you know, intra-party squabbling. I think the other thing to say here is oh, no, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great. Thanks for all of that. Really a lot to chew on. I guess maybe before we move to audience questions, I do want to, and I know, well, you know, we just covered kind of where this originates. I know people want to hear about what the hell is going on right now. And then, of course, we want to, as a mission of our school, to think about what people can do to try to meet the moment. And so I guess maybe I'll take it to that second question of what's going on right now and pose it this way, which is, you know, sort of a hobby horse of academics is to talk about the contradictions that exist within this coalition and sometimes try to project forward the way in which these contradictions are going to feed upon themselves or undermine the coalition. And I'm wondering right now as we watch these first few weeks whether that's as much a desire as a analytic as a clear-headed analytic approach. And so just these past few days, I mean, it's way too early to really understand what is going on. And I don't think we have this time or space here to detail the complexities of the Treasury payment system or the DOGE agenda at the Department of Labor. But I guess to the extent that this is a kind of new, on the one hand, we've characterized this as something different from old guard conservatism. On the other hand, there's a little bit of a wrecking ball going through the federal government right now. And you've all spoken about both of these things. And so just applying this analysis to the last few days, how are you making sense in real time? And, you know, we should probably, you know, we should have this conversation again in 6 months, maybe 2 weeks and a year. But in the moment, kind of just like a moment in time, how are you putting together these pieces of the contradictions, the fissures, and the and just the evidence of the last few days?
So, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about Project 2025 for the last 2 years, talking to a lot of people about like my greatest fears, what it would ultimately look like if it came to pass. And you know, what I didn't anticipate was something like DOGE, and more specifically, its reliance, just like almost its digital coup type strategy, right? So if you know, you saw the links to stuff I'd written like 2 years ago about Project 2025, and I used language like, oh, they're going to hack the system, oh, they're going to short circuit things, but that was all supposed to be like cute metaphors, right? But they're literally doing that. And what I was talking about is how they're going to take administrative law, so the collection of laws and norms that build up the administrative state, and sort of literally hack them, or not literally, figuratively hack them in various ways to accomplish their ends. And you don't really see a lot of that yet. You see elements of that, like with the Schedule F and various things. What I didn't anticipate, like I said, was these guys literally going in with private computer servers, stealing data, manipulating them in various ways. What I really thought was that administrative law, with this sort of reliance on norms and judicial enforcement, was going to be like the weak point that they were going to exploit. And they still might, right? That's still TBD. But really what they've exploited is like computer systems, code, these things that I don't understand. I can barely check my email. But that's where they're at right now. And that's sort of been like the leading spear of this attack. If there's a silver lining, administrative law has held up so far. But I thought administrative law attorneys were going to be the heroes here. Right now, it's like IT. That's who we needed. Those are the heroes we need right now.
I'm very skeptical about attorneys being the heroes as an attorney myself. Yeah, no, I didn't expect what is currently happening, although to some extent, President Trump is doing what he said he was going to do. But I just didn't think he would. So it is quite scary. What I mean, to the question of what do we do? I mean, on the one hand, I really, that role of organized labor here is just tremendous. I mean, again, they are on the forefront of of the legal battle on the one hand, right? Like filing so many of the lawsuits that are attorneys there, but attorneys for the work for unions, for the labor movement, filing the lawsuits, being on top of what's happening. I think there's the other question is about, will there, what kind of employee and organized resistance will there be? And we see some of it, individual employees within the federal employment, within the federal workforce. And then the question will be, does that extend to kind of broader collective action, to strikes, to, other forms? And does that spread? Right. I mean, if we look at how the National Labor Relations Act was found constitutional in the first place, right, with a Supreme Court at the time that was very much poised to strike it down, as it had struck down virtually everything else thus far that was part of the New Deal. The hysterical record is, there's a lot of things that were going on, but it seems quite clear that it was the massive sit-down strikes of auto workers and others that kind of, convinced the Supreme Court and elites that there were, the danger of pushing things this far was too much. So I started to look at some of the questions in the chat, and we can talk more about it. But there's this question of like, what do we do? Well, the massive collective action by workers has changed history. I think the thing I worry about, though, is whether we are too fissured. Whether unions are too fissured, whether working class folks are too fissured, for that to happen. And that's why I talk so much about the need to kind of explore, our own divisions within what we would think of as kind of the resistance.
I think I was most shocked and surprised by the wide-reaching nature of the effort to both control language and speech through these, anti-DEIA orders. At first it seemed almost comical that these guys are just they think everything's DEI and everything's DEI, but what these orders have really manifested in is the complete limiting of language in both a way that's detrimental to, I think, us as a multicultural nation, but detrimental to everything that relies on government data and anything within the bureaucracy. So I was speaking to a researcher who's at the University of Maryland College Park, and she showed me a list of words her boss said you're not allowed to put in grants anymore because the Trump administration will reject them. One of them was systemic. She studies systemic lupus erythematosus. I think I butchered that last part, but she studies a disease with the word systemic in there. Barrier. You can't put the word barrier the blood-brain barrier. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so that I think I was most shocked at. And I think, Samir, I'm gonna blow some smoke your way. I think the academics are actually the ones who I'm really looking towards and relying on, because once the Trump machinery percolates down to our data gathering and things like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, once they figure out how to manipulate or just, short staff the statisticians and the people who collect our data, I worry about the amount of institutions that rely on this data. We've already seen them willing to cut off the entire health care apparatus, health disease prevention apparatus, I should say, not just healthcare, but the entire healthcare communications apparatus. They just shut down, as so many hospitals rely on these things. And I was very shocked at the willingness to just do something so blunt. But I think the ways that we can fight back is, we preserve documents, we remember history, we discuss history, and to everyone who is more mathematically minded than I am, you crunch those numbers, you do the statistics, and but I think this is the time where universities and, in a labor sense, the graduate students need to come together as a collective force, because I think our country is really going to be relying on the graduate students for what we took for granted came out of the federal government in a lot of ways.
Thanks. Diane, did you want to jump back in?
Just, because I am an academic, I feel the need to insult us. It's like the opposite, right? I'm just like, please also don't rely on the academics. And because to some extent, to point to kind of the class cleavages that we're talking about, I feel like one of the biggest losses of kind of union leadership in the Democratic Party was a real, again, kind of, and I saw someone in the chat who's not happy with, I think, my use of the term working class, but like, folks who, that there was kind of academics took on, I think, a really leading role for like defining our moral trajectory. And like, we are also, there's problems with us. And, we are also kind of socialized to believe in merit and to be individual, to be somewhat individually focused. And I also think kind of the extent to which highly educated folks who went through the socialization process of university, of graduate school, of whatever, they then also have a particular vision of anti-racism and anti-sexism and all of those things. And I think the extent to which there's been this false narrative constructed of like working class folks are, that they're racist, right? Like the professional managerial class is also real racist. And I think that, we need kind of more economically diverse voices talking about kind of what is our social justice mission, because I think it can look different than what, folks in my position who, again, like, I will rewrite a paragraph for 10 days, right? Like I cannot be the voice of kind of the resistance. And that's why I think I want to see a greater economic diversity and professional diversity, worker diversity in our resistance.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that the linkage of like economic class is a much more powerful and sustainable coalition than this yeah, exactly like what you were saying. I know that so well. Like I grew up in the town where Stanford is, and so many people exactly like that. And I do and that's another kind of area where it is uncomfortable for people to kind of talk, but I think focusing so much on language and words and things like that, that has a tendency, that's not an agreed upon base that we as just a society have. Whereas I do think economic class is something that's very real. And frankly, I think when push comes to shove, you do see the wealthy and the powerful. Most people align almost, organically on this. Like the wealthy will put aside cultural differences if it means protecting their general power status. And that kind of goes to your first question, which was what's tying this coalition of Trump together. It's a lot of just really wealthy people. It's a bunch of billionaires. And that's kind of the thing right now, tying everybody in the White House together. And I don't know if that puts the working class right-wing populist. I think they got sold snake oil on this one.
Can I jump in real quickly because it, to tie in a question from the audience, it's academia has become unmoored from like sort of everybody on the ground reality, but also the administrative state itself. And there was a question about, what role did the Obama administration sort of play in laying the foundation here, and that's it, right? The birth of the administrative state, the modern administrative state, was really this idea of bringing together on the one hand, expertise like professional experts, but also like democratic participation from the public, right? And this is what was like the engine behind this, right? Bringing these two things together. Like John Dewey, a social philosopher, has this great metaphor of, it's the shoemaker who can fix the shoe, but ultimately it's the shoe owner who tells the shoemaker where it pinches, right? And this is how we sort of come together, experts in the public, to solve public problems together. And this was the vision of the administrative state. But then we get to the Reagan administration. We introduced things like the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs and cost-benefit analysis. And now expertise just increasingly takes over the dominance of what drives regulatory decision making and how the administrative state moves along. And that was just a conservative thing, right? But then, Bill Clinton comes in, embraces it. Obama comes in, brings in his OI administrator, Cass Sunstein, who kicks it up to like 11. And what ends up happening is you have this complete evaporation of like the public from the administrative state. It becomes completely untethered from on the ground reality. It's going to be like, we're going to solve problems like we are solving algebra equations. And that's such a huge departure from what we saw during like the Johnson administration, the war on poverty, where the administrative state strove for something called maximum public participation feasible. So yeah, that's where we're at now.
Thanks. This is great, everyone, and thanks audience members for these great questions that are trickling in. I was James, where you just took us is where I wanted to try to pull a few questions from the audience together that kind of overlap in theme, and one of them is this one point that you're drawing upon about the contribution of the Democratic Party over the last 30 or so years to undermining faith in government as something that can make people's lives better. And we've got a question from, there's John in the chat poses a question to this effect. Jesse similarly asks, isn't part of the point of pressuring federal employees to resign to reduce the capacity of these agencies to function so as to further discredit them with the people that they are supposed to serve? And then connecting this back to the question of what can be done. Nicole submitted a question as a president of a private sector union local. How should we be thinking through what our role is? We're talking a lot about the public sector and federal employees, AFG and National Treasury Employees Union and postal workers are going to be leading this in a lot of ways, but where do private sector unions fit in? And I guess the way the gloss I would put on all of these together is we are getting bombarded with what seems to me the most ruthless and dangerous set of attacks that any of us have ever experienced that maybe have occurred in this country since the 1860s. I really do believe that, and figuring out how to dig our heels in and minimize the consequences is crucial. At the same time, these attacks are coming on the heels of, as John noted, a longer history of bipartisan consensus on demeaning government and demeaning people who depend upon government. And so how do we think, and this is, I guess, this is an age-old question, but how do we do the short term with, the short term immediate fight with also thinking through the longer term one, which organizations like Nicole's private sector union local need to be a part of, as well as federal employees. So that's a big set of, again, kind of rambling questions for you, but please take them however you.
Well, I guess on to your the first of those questions, what have Democrats contributed to this? I definitely think it's been a bipartisan problem that has contributed to this real angst towards government. Throughout the Clinton era, they were much more of a pro-corporate, a privatization party, one that wanted to slash a lot, government benefits. But I think part of the thing that like Democrats became, particularly during the Obama era, is they became very obsessed with technocracy. Am I saying that word correctly? But it really felt that everything was very academic to a point that it made sense in the world of academia and wasn't, I don't think, translating into things that the public understood. I know the irony. I was just saying we need more of the academics. But I think this is something that, actually Bernie Sanders, when he ran for president, he really understood, which is that throughout the Obama era, Democrats became obsessed with the ideas of tax credits and, long-term policy planning and using all of these different kind of legal maneuvers and creating a framework by which low-income people could access services. And Sanders said, even before 2020, he said, just send people money. They'll know what to do with the money. Don't means test it. Don't, make it only accessible from a certain portal. Don't make it, come with all of these. Just give them the money. If they need money for food, just give them the money. Let them spend it on food. And he said most people are going to end up, using that in a means that is going to sustain them. But I think the other thing is he was really saying, give these things to people that make measurable differences in their immediate lives and tie that to your broader economic vision of long-term growth. I think that happened in the Biden administration in some ways. They take the biggest whacks against corporate monopolies because that was something Democrats really, really did badly on. In the name of low prices, they basically let all of these corporate monopolies show up. That creates this billionaire class we're dealing with. That just destroys the ability to generate wealth, particularly in the grocery store sector, the restaurant sector, real avenues of wealth generation for tons of families wiped out by Walmart and chains of the like. And so, yeah, I think that this was something that the Democrats became really, really out of touch because they started doing well in places that were doing very, very well. I mean, Bay Area, the high-tech industry, the financial industry. And I think that for a long time, they thought that they can figure out a means to kind of be like the anti-Paul Weyrich, be like, we can have pro-corporate and pro-worker policies. And you really can't. And I think people were starting to understand that. And whereas Republicans were hollowing out government, sometimes with the Democrats, it was hard to understand what they were even doing with the government. And I think a lot of people were already living in an era where the public services had been slashed almost every decade since the 1970s. And, people said, yeah, what does the government do? And on that, as just a fundamental level, I think a lot of people actually started to wonder, what does the government even do at the end of the day? What gets passed? What resolution? Trump kind of gets that to a degree because he came from like the TV industry. He's like the real estate guy. He understands when you open a building, you have a big showing with the press and blah, blah, blah. even if you're just, standing there with the shovel and then you leave, he kind of understood that idea that, doing something for the show and letting that translate. But I think with the Democrat contribution, that's where they contributed in both policy, and then they lost touch with a lot of the population in that, and that's how they've contributed to this kind of idea that a lot of people feel, which is that the government doesn't do anything. Even though we saw last week when the federal payments were all stopped, how many different things were threatened, and I think it was a big wake up call to a lot of people that you may not realize it, but your life is very much influenced by the federal government.
I think, Diana, you're muted, I think.
Oh no, like the classic. I should be beyond this now, the forgetting to unmute. Okay, so talking about kind of the longer term origins of the administrative state, I think James' comments are so useful to, what is the role of kind of people and popular politics in the administrative state? And I think he correctly, articulates that there was a vision for that. But, what's really interesting when it comes to labor, part of the reason that there was this drive to have labor issues handled by an independent administrative agency was partly because the labor movement was so, hated the federal courts, right? And with good reason, right? So, there's really good scholarship on the extent to which the American labor movement was forever impacted by kind of the era of government by injunction when federal courts were enjoining all, strikes and collective labor activity as antitrust violations or as criminal conspiracies. And to some extent, our approach with law ever since has been this kind of, can we not be in kind of elite courts? But what is so strange, though, is that kind of what agencies to some extent became were themselves kind of, elite, technocratic, expert driven. And the NLRB has been particularly hamstrung by this because on the one hand, they are forbidden from hiring economists. So in a world in which you're supposed to have expertise, they are not allowed. They're allowed to develop legal expertise, but not economic expertise, which, is incredibly, I think an important part of this narrative, right? Like who gets to articulate economic theories? But at the same time, right, if labor, it also means though that kind of in this expert driven agency, there becomes this real emphasis on kind of, collective bargaining as industrial peace and, kind of, not expert driven economics, but just kind of really basic economics. And what there isn't is an emphasis on full freedom of association or, worker freedom or kind of the more normative stakes of what you're doing in the labor movement, because that's not what you do in agencies. You don't necessarily talk about freedom. And so I also, I argue that there's been this loss of not having that conversation in a kind of more public forum, notwithstanding the fact that, you can't, federal courts, are elite institutions in their own way, but administrative agencies have become as well. And it, to the extent we want to talk about what does it mean, to go back to Project 2020, their language, what does it mean for a worker to be the architect of their own destiny, right? Like those are conversations that shouldn't be limited to agencies. And so, I think part of this is trying to figure out how to broaden that. And then for, what do we do now? I mean, I think like, as I mentioned before, unions are playing such an important role and I think can play an even more important role in kind of immediate resistance. But I also think what they need to be doing and can do uniquely is this broader organizing, right? Of the like melding the cleavages that have occurred within kind of whatever we would think as the resistance, in part by like listening to people. There's this moment right now where, I think academic elites who used to be much more skeptical about unions are very pro-union, but at the same time, on the comments I get from them are like, well, why isn't that union telling its members to, agree to get vaccines? Or why isn't that union telling its members to like do this progressive thing? And, the response is that's not what unions do, right? To some extent they do, right? But it's not a nonprofit. It is an elected, it is a democratic organization that is responsive to what its members want. And I think that's actually really valuable, because a lot of I think there's a concern that to some extent the nonprofit industrial context wasn't clear about what some of the people it claimed to represent were feeling, were doing, how they were going to be voting. And I just think unions have an incredible role to play there. Immediately stop the hemorrhaging, like stop the horrors, and then longer term, how do we build broader solidarity and a bigger vision of what a multiracial functioning democracy can be.
Awesome, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get to one final point, which has come up with a few panelists, and I know is on the minds of many of our audience members who are public employees in the city and state. And this is, we're talking here a lot about the attacks on the federal government and on the federal workforce. But I think we would be mistaken if we didn't presume that this is going to reverberate downward to state and municipal level public employees in a variety of ways. Obviously, Trump installed the Supreme Court justice that gave us the Janus decision in his first term, and we can only imagine that more of that kind of thing is coming. And so Carmen and Ivan in the chat both asked questions about this, kind of what we might imagine the reach of Project 2025 downward into state and local government might be. So and I should say, many of our students at the School of Labor and Urban Studies are public employees at the city level and are members of city unions, and so I know are thinking about this question. And again, this is we're speculating to some degree, but in terms of people who have the expertise to speculate intelligently, I don't think there's anyone better.
Certainly, some actions that would come out of, I was going to say the Department of Education, although now there's a question of if that will still exist. But in Project 2025, they had outlined a policy for expanding school vouchers. And in particular, the idea being that the school vouchers would go to parents. They could use them to go to private Christian schools. And, what school voucher programs really are is just a way to use public money to fund private schools, in this case, ideologically aligned private schools. And another interesting thing about how this can percolate down onto the local level is another rung of that is that schools are a really big community center in a lot of their communities, even in big urban cities like New York City. Schools are in an entire social ecosystem within the broader neighborhoods that they exist in, and they're the center of a lot of just community gathering and activity. It's where people get to know their neighbors. And in one way, this kind of school voucher thing to try and lead people out of schools, maybe get it defunded, but also kind of break that community, that organic community gathering space with a lot of public sector employees in it, and just empowering the private sector. And so that's one that just immediately came to mind about how I think it could get down to the local level. That being said, now with this whole Department of Education thing and Doge, I don't know what that throws into there, but I know that is something that Linda McMahon was in favor of doing when she was in Connecticut as well.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. I think Doge hacked my internet or something. So like local primacy over things like public health and stuff are, very much in danger now, I think, with Project 2025. Environmental policies, and so you can sort of envision the federal agencies using federal funding or the threat of taking away federal funding to put local public health agencies, like let's say they want to push vaccines or certain kinds of treatments for folks addicted to drugs, all these sorts of things. If they're considered out of line with the president's ideological disposition, you have to give them up or lose critical funding. Environment, I mean, we're already seeing FEMA threatening California's FEMA funding if they don't give up local climate policies, right? So all of us grew up hearing that conservatives were all about government at the local level, closest to the people. But surprise, another area of hypocrisy being excavated by Project 2025.
Diana, you have anything on this?
I think I've said a lot already.
Okay. Um, well, I think in the remaining time we have, it may make sense just to let you all, having chewed on whatever has been said, offer some concluding reflections. We've got about 5 minutes left, so rather than tee up a whole nother question, and maybe there's a lot of anxiety, of course, which is an understandable emotion given the severity of everything going on. And I don't think that we should suggest that people shouldn't be anxious, but if there are ways in which, we could close this by, again, returning to what is happening, what could be happening, what kind of fight we ought to be building, all of what you've all said, but just, it doesn't hurt to say that one more time just to bring it home. So I'll let you each give a couple minutes of closing remarks.
So progressives don't have any of the levers of power right now. We're not setting agendas or anything like that, which can be frustrating, but can also be liberating, right? This is a chance for us to focus on, I mean, if we're going to be in a reactive posture, how can we do that in the most productive way? This is a time to hone our message, our vision for what we want. Something that can help unite us in the face of their efforts to divide us, to set us up to hit the ground running when we do acquire control of the levers of power. And that covers a lot of areas. My bailiwick is the administrative state, so I think about nerdy things like, what does a progressive administrative state in a multiracial functioning democracy look like, right? It's not the kind of thing that's gonna win elections or dazzle your friends at cocktail parties, but it's important. And we can all sort of play that role in our own little spheres of building, starting to articulate and promote a vision of what we want. I think too long the left has been sort of reactive in that. It's saying, well, we don't like what the right is doing. We want slightly less of that. So that's sort of like the Obama neoliberalism with a smile sort of routine. We got to get over that. That's not going to cut it anymore. We need to be affirmative and own what we want.
No more neoliberalism, the smile. I love that.
Yeah, I think with what we're seeing, it is very unprecedented. And there's been a lot of times in the last 4 to 8 years that we've heard this is an unprecedented moment, this is a pivotal moment for the nation. But every everyone I've talked to who knows something about what's happening with this Elon Musk Doge situation, they're very concerned about what will happen to these agencies. And this might sound a little old school, like 1920s radical, but I think there's a lot of importance and power in cultivating the local community, but by kind of filling the gaps that the administrative state had played in a lot of our lives. And I do think that it is going to be something that people don't realize what government did in their lives, but once it goes away, there's a degradation of these kinds of services. And so, I don't know what form that looks like. I don't know if it's, it could be, community local libraries. There are these things in DC where little boxes and people can take a book, take out a book. Seems like a innocent little thing, but look, if public libraries are going to, struggle for funding, that's a means that you're going to be able to share information, especially when all of the mass communication tools are owned and manipulated by close allies of the current administration, X and Facebook, all the other social media. Yeah, TikTok, all of them were at the inauguration. So yeah, I think ways that you can cultivate community and bridge these gaps. And I think that some of it might not be that you can fill in what the government did exactly, but you can provide a support system and a network. And, in some ways, that's what a lot of government services do. They're sort of like education to help you understand the system. When I lived in Boston, for example, the city just has an entire department that just helps people like understand their housing issues. And you have a meeting with someone and they just explain where you should go. That's a really critical service to deal with abusive landlords and whatnot. And that's something that the community would probably have to step in if the funding goes away. So I guess think local is my takeaway from our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think my takeaway is not a legal one. It's very much a kind of something about people. I was an organizer in Texas, where I grew up before I went to law school. That's where I got my start in kind of the labor movement, and I organized public sector workers in Texas, in a state with no collective bargaining rights, and in a place where people were very politically diverse, very racially diverse. I think kind of maybe progressivism's discovery that not all people of color are radical progressives, is actually really useful. I think there's an extent to which progressivism has lived with like a kind of idealized version of human beings and particular human beings that was actually a little kind of, infantilizing or essentializing. People are complex, including, people of color, including poor people, including working class people. And what I loved about the labor movement then, and what I love about it now, is that it tries to find ways to bring people together, while leaving room for difference, right? It's not about coming up with kind of completely ideologically homogenous groups. It's about building coalitions based on the ways in which, when we concretely recognize how our lives are intertwined and how other people's well-being is intertwined with mine. I think we have been very kind of ideology focused on the left for a long time, of like, here are the correct views to have. But people's views are formed based on their material circumstances. And, there's a lot of diversity of views out there. And I think, the future is in trying to talk to each other more, and in trying to build a kind of more inclusive, broader coalition. And that's hard and messy, but honestly, it's also kind of, the whole purpose of being human, I think. And so, what we're going through right now is awful if it leads to kind of a soul searching and a deeper form of connection and organization. Well, that's, that would be great.
That's a great set of reflections to close this on. Thank you all so much, James, Arjun, Diana. This was really, really terrific. Thanks for thinking through this crazy moment with us. Audience members, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.